On peut avoir cette conversation en français et anglais ou les deux. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Are there any questions, comments? No? Okay, so I'll start with the first one, as it's my duty. I think I will use the question that was posed at the end of last panel about the future. And so I think you basically clearly established the state of the arts and how each organization in universities, Deviant, OBORO, and Molior have developed different, that have worked together with artists, have basically set the basis of media art production in Montreal. So I'd like to ask you about the future. So what are the future, it could be utopian or like an idea of the future, or it can be a concrete project your organizations are working on.
Well, is it working? Yeah. Well, recently at OBORO, of course, like following the, I mentioned that the founders, you know, there was a transition from the founders, and that brought the organization, like we were thinking, where do we want to go from here? And we did a big strategic vision project. And the main thing that came out of it is that, and I talked about time here, is that we want to work not like this, but like this. Deep, you know, long, deep roots. And I think that's something to think about when we're developing projects where everybody's always so busy, you know. How are you doing? I'm busy, you know, and it's about like, how do you make time? And so I think that's one consideration that's very important.
I would say the future is very exciting, and I would say fragile also in many points, you know, socially, politically, artistically. It's super interesting to see the development along the technological development. I think also we're quite lucky here in Montreal, in Quebec, because for the people outside our community, you know, they have to know that Quebec is the province in Canada that support the best their artists, their arts organizations. Culture is something very important here. And we can see in North America the difference it makes in what we have here in terms of festivals, events, artist centers, museums, etc. And artists also, the talents that we're able to develop because, of course, we have the support of Ottawa and with Canada and Montreal. But in our case, you know, the Arts Council of Quebec, the Ministry of Communication and Culture of Quebec were very important to create also this network, this informal network that I was talking about, to disseminate our works outside Montreal, outside Quebec, because I don't like the word market, but the market is very small here, and it's very important to go beyond our city.
The future is quite interesting, and in some ways, again, given the election in the United States, which is just, and Brexit, and what may come next in Europe, it gives us a lot of pause to think about what the role of artistic practice is in the world. And so, I mean, this is the only place the imaginary is actually being exercised, because political and economic imaginaries are just collapsed, you know, as you see, or they're a different kind of imaginary than what most of us in this room would have imagined. So it's, you know, traveling a lot, as all of us do. We are extremely privileged here. We live in a bit of a bubble, I have to say, you know, and that's good. I mean, it's protecting us in some ways, you know, even though the US is an hour away. So there is a very unusual mix here, and when I go abroad, I always talk about a certain kind of ecology. It's very rare that you have this ecology between academic, cultural, and even sometimes commercial institutions in one place. This is very, very unusual. And lots of places try to do this and fail miserably. And part of it is because of Quebec's history. Part of it is Montreal as a very interesting, multicultural, bilingual, mixed city. Part of it is size. We're at a scale where we can do this, whereas you can't do this kind of work in London or New York anymore, or Paris, or even Berlin, which has 10,000 artists but has no support for those artists. So it's a very, very privileged position that enables this kind of work, these kinds of paradigms, these kinds of models of research creation or artist-run centers to still flourish in the midst of what I think is a total catastrophe, basically, internationally. You know.
Maybe to follow on what you said, I think it's also connected with our way to be adaptable, in the sense of being aware of what's going on and maybe not stay in some kind of comforts, but to be really able to measure what's going on and to be able to react and maybe go into some kind of more complexity, in, like, as you say, that like with the changes of funders and stuff that have done so great job, for example, in our field, and now what do we have to do? Like, what can we do in a way to as you mentioned, go deeper and so more complex, and really ask ourselves why are we doing that? You know, why are we doing these projects? And you know, how can we really have an impact and reach the public? And you know.
Maybe I would add, like digital art is a good example of what we could call transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, etc. And I think that it's kind of also a kind of future of art, you know, to be able to touch all the disciplines in the same time. So, as you can see, you know, the Arts Council of Canada and Quebec also are applying this new rule to get out of those silos. So there's something happening there, but because we're still we're in transitional period, which is super exciting in terms of art, culture, technology as well, of course. And but as artists, as art organizations, we are also still caught, coincé in this transition, because there's the old traditional disciplines that are still there, well established, that drain all the money from the different support organization, and there's this energy coming from us, I would say, that
I mean, it's interesting what Alain says, because I'm working with several very large-scale cultural organizations now internationally, and they're all struggling to transform. They realize that the world now is different than it was 30 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even 10 years ago. And so there is this, they're trying to look at how other fields do things, you know, and it's very interesting, because you hear more and more, you know, in the 1990s you heard the MFA is the new MBA, you know, this is a very funny term. And you hear, I was just in Barcelona on a EU panel about the role of artists, and now the European Union is trying to insert artists into large-scale commercial research projects, because they realize that most of these organizations don't have a clue of what they're doing and need other ideas and other ways of thinking. And of course, that's instrumentalization as well of artists, which is very tricky. It's a very Faustian line to walk on. But at the same time, it's very interesting to see, you know, when all push comes to shove, everyone turns to artists. What do we do? You know, what? Because it's another way of looking at the world that doesn't fit within these established disciplines, frameworks, contexts, boundaries.
So I would add that, especially with the latest exhibition we did at Arsenal during the third Biennale, we really put our 1 foot into the contemporary art visual world. And I think, I have the impression this is the last discipline that really struggles to recognize digital tools as un outil de création honorable, I would say, because there's also all this thing about copy. Is that an original? Is that an object? Can I buy it? There's this market thing also, which is interesting to see. It's interesting to see that this discipline is in transition as well because of the advent of what we do.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi. Still trying to formulate this question in my head, so bear with me. Continuing on from what you said about art's role in the world, and particularly in light of the current political situation and so on, something I've been thinking about a lot in my time throughout the art world. I used to work in a contemporary art gallery before I started with new media work. Is that I've felt for quite a long time that the language in which art is couched is becoming ever more esoteric in some ways. You're kind of traveling down this path that ultimately is preaching to the choir. And I think that somewhat paradoxically, when you look at new media work and the digital arts and so on the one hand, the ability to disseminate and spread this work far and wide, faster and easier than has ever been the case before, is a great boon to humanity. On the other hand, I worry that digital arts requires a degree of technological sophistication, both individually and culturally, that is outpacing a large chunk of the world's ability to keep up with it. I don't have an answer to this, and I don't think you can stop it. You can't close Pandora's box. But what's your view on this? And do you have any ideas of how you'd see that developing and what could be done to counter it, or even if anything should be done to counter it?
Yeah, well, we could have a long discussion about that. It's funny, a lot of times with curators in performing arts institutions, for instance, I talk to them, they say, oh my God, this is so expensive. You know, this is like, these technologies are expensive. I said, no, the technologies are not expensive, it's people that are expensive. The knowledge is expensive, you know, to give people support and time to develop things, because we're talking about a space that crosses between existing tools, the invention of new forms and tools and processes that you don't know what's going to come out. It would be as if you were in the theater and the lighting designer said, well, let's imagine what that light might be like, but we don't have it invented yet, you know? And if you look at the history of the performing arts, the visual arts that have involved technological transformation, that happens all the time. You know, there are new tools come and they change forms and practices and things. So, it's interesting to think about that tension because, you know, as we know now, technology is not only, I mean, of course, we're saturated in a technical culture more so than ever before because people carry it on them all the time. It's, Jonathan Crary says, it's 24/7. Everything is vying for our attention in a different way than the end of the 19th century when advertising starts to arise and, you know, starts to vie for our attention, but we don't carry it with us. We don't sleep with it. It doesn't occupy every waking moment of our lives, which is why people want to stop and slow down and turn things off and, you know, go away from social media. And so there is this kind of constant thing that's happening. And so you would think that this kind of art that you're seeing, these art forms you're seeing, these emerging forms or whatever, would just be like normal life. But at the same time, you see that they extend that and frame it differently. And a lot of times people say, well, what's the difference now between Google and this artist, you know? And it has to do with the frame. It has to do with the, you know, flipping something and saying, well, no, it may use the same set of tools, but it's actually doing something else. So.
Est-ce qu'il y a une autre question, commentaire?
No, it's more a very short commentary on something Chris said about being fortunate of being here. As a European, I don't know if established here now because I'm professor of dance with technology in the dance department at UQAM. But being European, I don't know if you really realize how fortunate you are, not only in terms of funding, which was the first thing that Chris referred to, but in terms of cultural integration of the fact that the body is not separated from the mind. So research creation is an activity of back and forth between reflexivity and action, which in a country where I lived for 20 years, in France and Paris in particular. I was at Paris 8 University first, and then in an art school for 5 years. I left the university exactly for that, because you couldn't do stuff inside. I mean, we fought for 8 years in Paris 8 dance department to have one studio, and finally they gave us a studio with a column in the middle. And the column was square, so you couldn't do even pole dancing, because it would have been a very awkward pole dancing. So in France we had this separation between conservatoire, where you sweat, where you do stuff, but you don't think, because the intellectual formation and education of dancers is close to zero. And the university, where you have a very good intellectual studying, but you don't sweat, because you have a studio with a column in the middle. So it's impossible to sweat, because you crash into the column before reaching the sweat. So it's a double thing, and it's one of the reasons I came here. So I feel double fortunate for this integration that in a certain way refuses the Cartesian separation between the body and the mind, between a place in which you think, which is university, but you don't do, and the conservatoire, where is the place of the body, of the sweat, of the low things.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe this is where, you know, Chris mentioned that this research creation and studio lab really emerged out of artist-run centers, and I think they're still relevant today in terms of the ecology. And it's, yes, I agree that we're very fortunate. And when artists come and do residencies in a place like OBORO, they get paid, they get a fee. So, yeah.
No, it's interesting. The educational, pedagogical frame of this discussion is extremely important, because in Europe it's so separated from artistic practice. And actually here you see the students going through these universities and then going into this cultural sector and then going internationally, and then that's a big, of course that's a very big important thing, because there's a kind of synergy going on. It's not that the universities are separated from the larger culture as they are in the U.S. in some ways. Like, I went to Stanford, and you're in Palo Alto, surrounded by Google and Facebook, or at that time Sun and Apple, you know. But the university is like it just feeds the tech industry, but doesn't feed anything else. So it's that ability here to go between practice and making and thinking and is unusual. And that's, of course, that's a more North American thing out of a liberal arts tradition, that arts programs are integrated into, there are conservatories, but they don't have the weight that they do in Europe. that integration is happening. And so you get people making things differently because they're exposed to other things beside making art, which is just not particularly that interesting on its own, you know. If it doesn't tie into the broader social, technical, cultural world, it becomes as hermetic as, you know. So that's very, very critical.
Well, maybe that's also something which is like cultural and connected with the history, but like definitely in Europe things need more time to really get through the institutions, and some kind of ways to perceive things are kind of stuck for a longer time than in here. You can really see that it's kind of easier to experiment and open new ways of thinking, and but maybe that's more cultural and part of the history.
Maybe this has a lot to do with the history of Quebec too. You know, as you point out, Aurélie, that the institutions, I mean, they're bureaucratic, but movement happens faster. Things can happen much faster than they can in Europe. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it's not, they're not just sitting there as like they're expecting forever, you know. So that struggle is that political struggle is very, very important, and that's what fuels that energy versus the kind of state institutions in Europe that just sit there. I mean, they will change too. There will be a struggle coming. It's coming. I mean, we see it, but it's been you know, people have been complacent for a very long period of time. So.
But that had also, I think, an impact on the way that digital art has been developed in Quebec, compared to, well, I can compare with France because I come from there, and like when OBORO was established, that's 30 years ago? No.
Yeah,
no.
a little over 30 years.
Yeah,
it was 1982.
Yeah, and all the organizations that are that have been set up 15 years ago or 20 years ago in digital art in Montreal. If we compare with other cities in Europe that emerged quite later or not in the same number. So there was something open to that field here, maybe more than in Europe.
And maybe as what Claudine said, you know, it's the support of artists versus what happened in Europe, which is the building of institutions like the CKM and Ars Electronic and all these places that built museums, and those museums became outdated so fast, and then they're faced with giant apparatus without any support for projects, you know. And so by building these giant institutions and these massive apparatuses that required so much maintenance, and you know, you look at them now and you say, well, that was a stupid idea. Why did they do that? You know, why didn't they support production and support ideas as opposed to building these edifices? You know, and I think that was also with Hexagram that we realized, you know, okay, yes, you need a certain amount of space. You need space where people can meet, and of course you need certain kinds of equipment. But there's a transformation in 10 years of what kind, from big science to small, you know, from, you know, giant machines to maker culture. And this is a huge shift that institutions here are able to make faster than others, even in the US. So.
As my friend, oh, go ahead.
There is another reason also, in my opinion. I mean, participating in both worlds, you have a very different relationship, as someone said, to history. A small parenthesis is that it would be silly, as I hear a lot, to say that this is a younger country, so you're more free to invent. We are not. Nobody is younger than anybody. We come from. Everybody comes from the Rift Valley in Africa. So stop to say there are new countries and old countries. But the fact of being a colonialized country, that having benefited from crossing of different cultures and creating an interesting melting pot out of them, makes, in my perception, people from here more able to invent and have a lesser allegiance to history and to what has been in the past. In Italy, we say the philosophy of history in Italy has been dominated by the thought of Croce, who said, "Historia magister vitae." History is the master of life, so you learn from the past. And now it's no more like that. It's the ability to invent. That's why also here you're very strong in queer theories, in identification process, etc., more than in Europe. So the capacity to invent theory and the capacity to have a more free relationship to the past make you do this wonderful recherche-création idea, which Europe is struggling to copy. It will take a long time, as Chris said.
So I just want to comment on that. That is, my friend Pip Day is the curator at SBC, and she has this concept that institutions institute. And in relation to history, I think that when we you know, there's a lot of changes ahead of us and a lot of work ahead of us in terms of how history is going to institute here. And of course, I'm speaking specifically to our relationships with Indigenous peoples, because, you know, how has Canada instituted over the last 4 generations? It's by genociding. So I think that there's a lot of work there to think about.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you. Yes?
Thank you.
Merci. Thank you.